Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so very much for tuning into the show this week. Hello, and how are you, E.C.?
Great. How are you doing?
Wondrous. We're going to talk about microplastics. Microplastics. We're going to talk about what they are, and how they're entering our food, air, and water. And the food part is probably why we're talking about it. We're going to talk about the current scientific understanding of microplastics, potential health and environmental risks, and then some practical strategies to reduce exposure in everyday life. Microplastics is one of those things that everybody talks about, and I doubt anybody knows anything about. So let's start with the basics. And what are microplastics?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know that I should really be talking about it. I think it's probably a topic
All right,
that's
podcast
better.
over.
I know, and that was a good one. No, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a topic that's going to be better addressed by a toxicologist. I mean, somebody who's studied plastics and microplastics for some time. Not me. That's not me. It does overlap a bit with nutrition because some of these microplastics, they're going to be in our food. But when we look at various man-made chemicals, each of those chemicals has certain properties and certain routes of exposure. Do we eat it? Do we breathe it? Do we drink it? And those different forms can often take on different toxicity potentials. Like, is it more harmful to breathe it than to drink it, and all of that stuff? And where are we more likely to get it? So there are going to be legitimate experts in these different chemicals, like plastics and microplastics. I mean, this was my past life in environmental consulting. I mean, there was experts on arsenic, there's experts on PCBs, right? So there's going to be experts on plastics. And just like to give people that info, because this is sort of my cursory summary overlooking it, as I do understand there is some overlap with diet, which is, of course, where I actually do have some expertise. But here we go. With that disclaimer, here we go. So microplastics are these plastic particles that are less than 5 millimeters. And then there's also nanoplastics, which would be even smaller, let's say less than 1 micrometer. And so just for a reference, a strand of hair is 80 micrometers. So like nanoplastics are really, really small. They won't be able to be seen by the human eye. But I'm going to use the term microplastics to be an umbrella term for these really, really tiny small plastic molecules, to include nanoplastics, and of course to include different types of plastic. Because when we look at plastic, it's not all made up of the same chemical composition. There's varying types of plastic. So it's a big, broad umbrella term for these small plastic particles. Now we can think about microplastics as primary microplastics or secondary microplastics. Primary microplastics are those intentionally manufactured to be those small little particles. They might be in cosmetics, they might be in biomedical products like implants. And then secondary microplastics are these plastic particles that have resulted from the breakdown of larger plastic materials, like maybe the food wrapping has broken down, or tires when they're wearing down are releasing microplastics, or synthetic textiles like your clothing that has plastic in it, or household goods like carpet and furniture. And so this secondary microplastics is really going to be a big source of microplastics. It's not just the primary, the ones that are actually made to be that small, that are a problem. And these microplastics from the breakdown will just enter our environment. They could be in our soil, our air, our water. They can be contaminating wildlife, of course. They can be contaminating our food because of all the different places they are. And basically, they've been found everywhere, from the Antarctic to tropical reefs. And for us, we can be exposed to them in so many different ways. One, of course, is consuming contaminated water, consuming contaminated food. And the contaminated food could be maybe something stored in plastic, but it also could be, let's say, that you eat seafood that happened to also eat plastic in its environment, that it was kind of, as it was, scrubbing the bottom of the ocean or something like that, it happened to eat some of those plastics. It could also just be on plants, either through the accumulation from the soil, or it could be on plants that we eat because of the deposition from the air. We are also exposed to it a lot from personal care products like toothpastes and face scrubs and face washes and different soaps. We're also exposed to it through the skin, like microplastics can get through our pores, and that could be just from wearing these synthetic fibers that we do, or just being on furniture and clothing. And then inhalation's a big one, just breathing it in from them being released and degraded from these different sources. Microplastics are in the air, and so we're just breathing it in all the time. Basically, we're exposed to them everywhere, constantly.
All right, so I'm never going to breathe again, and I'm not brushing my teeth. Those are the two
Correct.
things that I'm going to be done doing. Okay. But in all seriousness, that could be overwhelming. That could be very scary if you don't understand the actual health implications of all of those things. So what does the research say? What have you come across as it relates to the health outcomes of microplastics?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the problem is we have a lot of ideas of what they could be doing, but here we go. More research needs to be done on the topic to be any more sort of conclusive about it. Of course, we've got concerns with them in the environment. We've certainly seen a lot of environmental concerns related to macroplastics and that, birds or wildlife mistakenly eating these things and causing digestion issues or death. So you can think about it as sort of the same idea, but of course now we're on this much smaller scale. And one of the main issues with plastics is it doesn't really degrade very well. Now, interestingly enough, it degrades enough to go from a plastic bag into these microplastics, but once we have these small little plastic particles, they just persist and hang around. And so the concern is, okay, they can start to accumulate in the various animals that we might eat, might hurt their own health, might hurt our health from eating them. Maybe these chemicals are accumulating in us, and maybe these exposures and accumulations of the microplastics are causing things like cardiovascular disease or GI disorders like inflammatory bowel disease, or respiratory disorders like asthma, or even certain types of lung cancer like non-smoking lung cancer. And so this is where there's a lot of ideas that they could be involved in this, but certainly, again, we don't really know or have conclusive evidence to say that. The other outcome, I know that sounds all very scary, but it also could be that these molecules are relatively inert. Like, yes, they are present in animals, or yes, they are present in us, but maybe these molecules don't really do anything. They just sort of accumulate, which would be great if that's what we happen to come to find out, because we want to also remember that just because something is present doesn't necessarily mean it's harming us. And there's probably going to be some dose and exposure that's going to dictate when it starts to be a problem. Now, one of the problems with identifying what is really going on with microplastics is actually in getting accurate samples. First of all, just the technology. I mean, if you think about it, like some of these particles, especially on the nano level, or, you can't see them by the human eye. They're less than a strand of hair. They can be made up of different things. They have to be separated out from the material that they're a part of. Like, just the technology to assess how many microplastics are in this sample. Okay, that's being developed right now. But another big problem with getting a real handle on what's going on is just contamination. Because remember I said that these microplastics are in the air. Or go find a lab that doesn't have plastic materials as either like the sampling material or the gloves that people use. Like, plastics are everywhere. So when you get a sample of something to say how many microplastics are in that, is that truly because that's how it existed in the environment? Or were those microplastics added by way of the fact that you had to store the sample and you handled the sample and you mixed the sample? So anyway, there's a lot of complicated factors here in being able to truly assess the level of microplastics, let alone nanoplastics, to understand what's going on. Now, our awareness and our use of the word microplastics has been around for some time. As far as I understand, it kind of was coined around 2004. But I think a lot of the questions and concerns have kind of come out in recent years. And I think it's in part because of a study that came out in 2024. It's the Marfella study in the show notes. Basically, they took 250 people that were undergoing a specific surgery for heart disease. It was a surgery to remove plaque buildup in their arteries, and that plaque buildup can lead to a heart attack, so they're taking it out. Now, what they did is when they took out that plaque, they measured the amount of these microplastics in that plaque. And those that had microplastics in their plaque had a higher risk of heart attack, stroke, or death in the 3 years after that surgery. And so the assumption, of course, after that came out, definitely was in the news, the assumption, of course, is that study finding people with microplastics in their arteries were more likely to die, is that, okay, the microplastics are driving the heart attacks and driving the fact that they had more death. But we have to remember, of course, this is an observational study, right? It was a pretty small scale, 250 people. It was a very specific population, people who already had heart disease and needed this surgery. We definitely can't be making this generalization to microplastics are causing plaques and causing heart attacks. We definitely can't say that. We can't even say that even in this population that was studied, the microplastics were causing the additional heart attacks, because again, it could be reverse causation. It could be the other way around, that maybe because they had heart disease, that is what allowed the plaque to accumulate more in those people. Maybe they had more severe heart disease. And this study also didn't look at diet and lifestyle, which of course, this podcast, we know we want to definitely control for things like, okay, what types of food are you eating? And are you eating whole foods? And how much are you eating? So that could be a major player in what really was driving the heart attacks versus necessarily the microplastics. And then, just as I mentioned, we can't rule out the fact that maybe these samples were subject to contamination from all of the microplastics in the lab environment. So the study did get a lot of press. It certainly is a great way to capture fear, this chemical that's around us that we don't really understand and know. And yes, now they're in plaques and people are dying, but we don't really have a good handle on what was driving the increase in heart attacks. We don't really understand what's the real risk around microplastics, and we really don't have any information to how to change someone's, let's say, even day-to-day life that significantly in any sort of, favorable or meaningful way.
Got it. Are there any regulations around microplastics? I mean, it strikes me as very hard to regulate something that you can barely tell where it is, what it is, how much there exists. But has there been any efforts, maybe in light of people saying, hey, this is killing us, you should do something about it? Has there been any attempts at regulation of microplastics?
Yeah, not a ton for the reasons that you kind of highlighted, right? Like if we can't really measure this accurately and consistently, like how the heck are we going to regulate this? So there haven't been any set limits on, microplastics in drinking water or food or soil or something like that. We're definitely in the more research needs to be done phase. And I would say that there's going to be years before we have anything conclusive like that. Now, I know people don't like to hear that because, again, it's a potential concern that we don't really know much about, but I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, it's good to think about what are the benefits that this chemical has brought us. I think it's easy to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're using plastic, but then you want to think about it, how much better off we are in terms of society in many cases because of plastic. I'm sure there's things in terms of food preservation or food costs that have really benefited us in terms of a species, that we always have to think about the trade-offs, that maybe the risk of this microplastic exposure is actually worth the trade-off of, again, cost or food preservation or food accessibility, something like that. The other thing is we also want to make sure that we take our time to really understand the risks and not just all of a sudden say, okay, we're not using plastic, we're going to use some other material, and then come find out that that substitution material was more of a problem than the plastic. And this actually happened somewhat recently with BPA or bisphenol A, which was a contaminant found in lots of bottles, and especially exposure to babies and young children was a big concern. And the substitutes they used for BPA ended up being more potent and more problematic. And so we don't want to go from the frying pan to the fryer, so to speak. We don't want to just rush to judgment and say we need to get rid of them, because we want to make sure that however we, quote, get rid of them, if that's what we have to do, that the substitute is better, right? Now, I will say, of course, we do have some regulations out there, like in the US, the Clean Water Act. Other industrialized countries are going to have stuff on just general waste, and we would love to see those increase globally, because remember, plastic waste and its degradation is a huge source of microplastics to the environment and therefore us. I'm not sure if some people know about this. I'm sure lots of people do, but I just love keeping up on it a little bit. The Ocean Project. Have you heard of that?
No, I don't think so.
I think he's out of the Netherlands, but Boyan Slat at 16 years old came up with the idea of cleaning up the oceans just generally as a project.
Ambitious kid.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, okay, we're just going to start with cleaning up the oceans. Here we go.
I was like, can I get a girl to look at me? He's like, let me fix the ocean.
Let's just clean up all of the oceans across the world. And they've started with cleaning up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is like this huge swarm of basically plastic, twice the size of Texas, between California and Hawaii. And that's cool. They've got these huge boats and interceptors that dredge up all the plastic. But they've also, of course, realized that, heck, we need to stop the stuff getting to the ocean. So they've got these river interceptors in all of these highly polluted areas of the world. And their goal is to get them in 1,000 of the world's most polluted rivers, and they've got 19. So, I mean, I think it's been going on for 10 years or so. It's absolutely incredible what they're doing. But those are the type of efforts to help mitigate plastic waste, is a really big thing for microplastics in terms of our exposure and how widespread it's going to be. Anyway, in terms of microplastics, yeah, there's not much. There has been some regulations in terms of eliminating microbeads, which are the less than 5 millimeter particles that are used in those like exfoliating or cleansing products. That's at the federal level. And I think that went into effect around 2018 or 19. And I think there might be some talk about trying to expand that into more cosmetic products and that type of stuff. So I think certainly more will continue to evolve and be regulated as, again, we learn what are the true risks around it. But not a ton.
Got it. As we wrap up, any tips as to what we can do collectively or individually to maybe lower our exposure?
Yeah, I mean, again, we don't have conclusive evidence that lowering your exposure will do anything.
Yeah.
So this is very much under the guise of like, well, maybe this is a problem. What would I do to maybe change my exposure that could potentially pay off? Mm-hmm. And I would think about it in the context of things that don't really require a ton of effort to do so. I know that there's people out there that say like, eliminate all plastic in your life. Okay, that's really hard to do, if not totally impractical to do, right? So instead of that sort of thing, it's like, okay, well, this might be a problem. We don't really know. We don't really know that our efforts are going to pay off. What can I do that would be a relatively light lift, if anything? And to me, some obvious places would be like storing and heating your food. I know back in my days when I was afraid of everything in terms of nutrition, I bought a slew of Pyrex containers that have literally followed me around the country. And I always use those for like heating and storing food. Even when I get frozen vegetables, I'll take them out of the bag and just put them in the Pyrex. For me, it's never been like this big effort. You know, I have to heat the food anyway. I have to store the food anyway. Let's just use glass instead of plastic, right? Do I know that's making a difference in my health? No. But again, it's one of these things that to me is like a relatively minor thing to do, which may pay off. And we do have more of a concern when we heat food relative to the release of microplastics. So definitely would be an area that I think is pretty easy to make that substitute.
Yeah.
Another one is bottled water. You know, again, I'm not really big into trying to freak people out, but the longer something is in contact with the plastic, the longer we're going to have some transference of the microplastics and the more it's exposed to high temperature. So like a case of water bottles in the trunk of your car as you just sort of like ride around. I don't know. Like that would be a place that you could reduce your exposure. Now, I'm not against plastic anything. Like again, if there's times to drink it, if you're traveling, or even when I go to the gym, I use a plastic bottle. I'm not going to bring a glass bottle to the gym. But there's times that I think that you can make the choice just not to always be using plastic, or cutting back on plastic storage bags, or cutting boards that aren't plastic, or do I always need plastic utensils? Again, all of these things where we have an easily accessible other available option, I think is fine enough to do and consider. We don't have to go back into paleo era and reject all, plastic, any development in our life. But I think there's some places that you could reduce exposure that would be most health protective, although we don't have the evidence it truly is doing anything.
Okay. So maybe last question, which is on the list of things, the long list of things that we're told are dangerous and killing us, from the red dyes to the microplastics to the various other things. Where does microplastic live on that list in your mind? Is this something that is important? We should be paying attention to it, but like everything you just said, like we can only pay as close attention to it as the science allows us to, and we really can't do it that closely. Or is it like this is a distraction, and the 20 minutes you've just spent listening to this podcast is probably the extent at which you should think about microplastics?
I think closer to the latter. I think we've been doing this podcast for just over 5 years, which is amazing. But this is the first time we're talking about microplastics. So I think that sort of sets the context of like where I put it on the list of things to think about. And I think we kind of just touched on this somewhat recently with the sugar diet. It's like something new is always compelling. And so something like microplastics can capture our attention, when in reality, we actually have evidence that maintaining a healthy weight and regular exercise and eating more fruits and vegetables and getting regular sleep, like we have definitive numbers on how they will improve our health. And we can't say the same for microplastics, right? So I think this is one of those things that's like, okay, sure, you don't want to store hot water bottles in your car and drink them only in exclusion if you want to be most health protective. But I wouldn't spend that much time fretting about it. And it's certainly not at the expense of doing any of the habits that we talk about all the time.
Got it. All right. Thank you, EC. Thanks everybody out there for listening to the show. Thanks for subscribing wherever you are listening or watching this. Do so, and you will make sure you do not miss another episode. EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.